So, picture an ancient religious clash. If you are like most people, you probably imagine a scene pulled straight out of, a Hollywood epic.
Right.
There are lightning bolts cracking the sky, massive stone statues crumbling into dust, and a lone prophet pointing a wooden staff while the earth just shakes.
And terrified villagers screaming about golden idols.
Exactly. It's very cinematic.
It is a highly theatrical way of viewing history, for
Yeah.
sure. I mean, we are totally conditioned to see these ancient narratives as these binary mystical battles.
Yeah.
The magical forces of good versus the magical forces of evil.
Which keeps the past safely quarantined in the past.
Yes.
We can look at those stories and think, well, I don't worship a bronze statue of a sun god, so this has absolutely nothing to do with my life.
Right, we strip the source material of any real-world teeth.
But today, in this deep dive, we are stripping away that whole mythological veneer.
Cool.
We are stepping into the Surah Hud narrative of Prophet Shu'aib, specifically his interactions with the civilization of Madian, looking at Ayat 84 to 95.
And suddenly all those crumbling statues and magical lightning bolts they're entirely gone.
Gone. Instead, we are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is shockingly, undeniably economic.
We really are. We're analyzing an ancient text that functions as this sophisticated, really gritty critique of systemic economic rot.
Yeah, and today's source material relies heavily on a brilliant, in-depth lecture by the scholar Parwez.
Right. And he argues that the conflict in Madian was not about mystical deities at all.
Not even a little bit.
No, it was the absolute definition of an ancient turf war over market regulations, labor exploitation, and basically the hoarding of wealth.
So the elites of Madian look at Shu'aib, who is out there demanding these ethical reforms, and they ask him a question that feels so aggressively modern.
No, it really does.
It's like it could have been shouted across a corporate boardroom yesterday. They ask him with just dripping sarcasm, does your prayer tell you what to do with my money?
Wow. Yeah, that single sentence shatters the illusion of this being just some dusty fable.
It really does.
It reveals the core friction of the entire narrative.
Yeah.
Because, the elites of Madian championed their own version of religious freedom.
Right.
They wanted religion strictly consigned to the mosque.
Keep it in the private sphere.
Exactly. Leaving capitalism and profit generation completely unrestrained out in the market.
But Shu'aib's revolutionary and frankly dangerous stance was that true faith, this concept of salat and ethical economics, are inherently inseparable.
They cannot be decoupled.
So, to everyone listening right now, I want you to think about your own workplace for a second. Think about the structure of our modern global economy.
Right.
Because we operate in a system that enthusiastically separates moral values from the bottom line, where we excuse almost anything with the phrase, it's just business.
Always. It's just business.
Today's mission is to unpack Parwez's analysis of Madian, because it turns out Madian isn't just an ancient city buried in the sand.
No, it is a terrifyingly accurate mirror. It reflects the structural vulnerabilities of literally any society that prioritizes profit over human dignity.
But to accurately read that mirror, Parwez insists we can't just drop straight into the markets of Madian, right?
No, we need the buildup. The source text deliberately constructs this chronological runway.
Right, it traces a pattern.
Exactly, a very specific pattern of civilizational collapse. It profiles the fatal flaws of the nations that preceded Madian. So we're talking about the people of Nu, Aad, Tamud, and Lut.
It's like a masterclass in the social physics of societal decay.
It really is. It reads almost like a diagnostic manual for how to destroy a civilization.
And the rot evolves, doesn't it?
It does. It doesn't start with sophisticated market manipulation.
No, it starts with Ayat. The text uses the civilization of Aad to represent the rot of brute imperialism.
Ayat is just the manifestation of sheer physical dominance.
Right.
The historical context provided by the text describes a civilization that achieved global supremacy purely through intimidation and physical force.
They extracted resources by simply overpowering anyone who stood in their way.
Yeah, they built these towering monuments entirely as displays of vanity and power, taking what they wanted because literally no one was strong enough to stop them.
It is tyranny in its most primitive, unrefined form.
Very primitive. The philosophy is entirely based on muscle. I am stronger than you, therefore your land, your labor, and your wealth belong to me.
It's the geopolitical equivalent of a schoolyard bully taking everyone's lunch money just because he can.
Exactly.
You don't need a complex legal framework when you have the biggest clubs and the sharpest swords.
Right. But eventually that primitive model evolves. The timeline in the text moves forward to the civilization of Thamud.
And the methodology of oppression becomes slightly more sophisticated there.
A lot more sophisticated. Thamud represents a profound shift in the mechanics of exploitation. They move from brute force to the privatization of public survival goods.
Wow.
Parwez points out that the narrative specifically highlights Thamud taking ownership of water springs and open pastures.
So they didn't just conquer territory.
No, they enclosed the commons.
That is a terrifying escalation.
It is.
Instead of constantly fighting wars to steal resources, you just build a fence around the only water source in the region.
Yeah.
You look at the basic non-negotiable necessities of human life, water, grass for livestock, and you declare, well, this is no longer a public right.
Right. This is private property, and I hold the key.
The leverage shifts entirely from the sword to the resource itself.
Exactly. You establish structural leverage. When a ruling class monopolizes the very elements required for survival, they no longer need to threaten you with physical violence.
Because your own biology becomes the weapon used against you.
Yes. The working class is forced into total compliance. They have to accept whatever exorbitant terms the elites dictate, simply to avoid dying of thirst or starvation.
You either sign the exploitative contract or you perish.
It's a protection racket built on human necessity.
And then we see the evolution continue with the nation of Lut, which the text uses to illustrate the breakdown of the foundational social contract itself.
Right.
We see a pervasive social and sexual perversion that just shatters the fundamental trust and interpersonal relationships required for a community to even function.
So all of these previous nations represent different vectors of civilizational disease.
Imperial violence, resource monopolization, social degradation.
Exactly. And that long, dark runway finally delivers us to the gates of Madian. And Parwez frames this arrival in a fascinating way. He labels the era of Madian as the age of economics.
The age of economics. So the methodology of corruption reaches its absolute peak of sophistication.
Yes. Madian was geographically blessed. The source notes describe them situated on major ancient trade routes, surrounded by lush, thick forests.
They were a bustling, incredibly wealthy hub of international commerce.
Their GDP was through the roof. But their fatal flaw, the rot that was hollowing out their foundation, was entirely hidden within their thriving markets.
The violence in Madian becomes invisible.
Totally invisible. They aren't relying on the brute physical force of Ayat anymore.
Right.
They do not need the overt, cruel water monopolies of Thamud. In Madian, the destruction of human life hides inside the spreadsheets.
It is buried in the exchange rates, the supply chain logistics, and the labor contracts.
Yeah.
It's chilling because, on the surface, everything looks incredibly peaceful.
Exactly.
Like if you walk through the streets of Madian, you wouldn't see riots. You wouldn't see armies slaughtering peasants.
The markets are overflowing with imported goods. People are trading. The city is just humming with industry.
But beneath that veneer of a perfect economy, there is a ruthless systemic predation taking place.
Which brings us to the exact nature of the confrontation. Shu'aib arrives in this prosperous, orderly society and declares that their entire economic foundation is corrupt.
And the elite's response to him is incredibly telling here.
Oh, very telling. They do not immediately threaten to kill him for praying. The text emphasizes that they actually offer him total religious freedom.
They essentially say, go ahead and pray, Shu'aib. Perform your ablutions, chant your chants, meditate in your home.
They have zero problem with his personal, private spirituality.
Because personal spirituality is deeply comforting to an exploitative ruling class.
Oh, absolutely. A religion that focuses entirely on internal peace, individual salvation, and, accepting one's lot in life is politically harmless.
In fact, it is beneficial to the status quo.
Highly beneficial because it pacifies the working class.
Right.
The conflict erupts with such ferocity because Shu'aib defines Salat not as a private meditation, but as a holistic system of divine values that absolutely demands authority over public business practices.
For Shu'aib, Salat isn't a retreat from the world. It is an ethical engine that must drive the world.
Exactly.
If your profound spiritual connection to the divine doesn't prevent you from cheating a customer or starving a laborer, then your spiritual connection is just a performance.
It's empty theater.
Which is why the elites hit him with that devastating question we discussed at the start.
Right. Does your Salat command you that we leave what our fathers worshipped? Or that we leave doing what we want with our own wealth?
I mean, notice the intense defensive possessiveness in the Arabic phrasing there?
Yes.
The concept of our own wealth.
They view their capital as a sovereign domain. It is completely immune to any external ethical oversight.
I earned this money. It is my private property. I will manipulate it, leverage it, and deploy it however I see fit to generate more of it.
They genuinely believe the market is a secular vacuum where morality simply does not apply.
And because Shuaib refuses to accept that premise, they resort to mocking him.
They do. Parwez highlights a brilliant piece of gritty realism in the text here. The elites refer to Shuaib using the Arabic words Halim and Rashid.
Which translate to forbearing and right-minded.
Yes, they are weaponizing his own virtues against him through sheer patronization.
Wow.
They are rolling their eyes and saying, oh, look at the brilliant Shuaib. Look at the only honest, pure man left in the entire market.
Look at Mr. Ethics trying to lecture us on how the real world works.
Exactly.
It is the exact same sneer you see today, aimed at anyone who tries to inject ethics into cutthroat corporate environments.
Oh, absolutely.
It reminds me of the modern phenomenon of ethics washing or corporate mindfulness programs.
Yes.
A massive global corporation will happily spend millions to build a state-of-the-art meditation room for its employees.
Right. They will hire a wellness guru to lead a weekend retreat on, finding your inner center.
They enthusiastically fund those initiatives because they promote a pacified, internalized version of well-being.
A centered, mindful employee might handle workplace stress better.
Which makes them more productive.
Exactly.
But the very second those centered employees take those spiritual values and walk onto the trading floor or step into the boardroom to demand an end to aggressive profit margins or question why the company relies on sweatshop labor in its overseas supply chains.
Suddenly, the meditation room is closed.
The corporation loves a god who stays in his lane.
Yes. And Shuaib is terrifying to Madian because his god owns all the lanes.
So we must ask then, what specifically were these elites doing in their markets that required such an aggressive defense?
Right.
If they were so prosperous, how exactly were they rigging the game?
Well, Parwez's analysis forces us to dive into the deep linguistic roots of the Arabic terminology used in the text to describe their crimes.
And the primary focus is on the word tabkasu.
Yes, tabkasu.
Which is often translated simply as shortchanging. And it usually appears in the text alongside commands to maintain accurate weights and measures.
Right.
When most of us read that, we immediately picture a very low-level petty crime.
We imagine a shady vendor at a local fruit stand discreetly pressing his thumb on the physical scale.
Yeah, so a customer pays for a full pound of grain, but only receives 3/4 of a pound.
But Parwez shatters that literal simplistic interpretation.
He does.
Tabkasu is not about a tip scale at a local bazaar. The linguistic root goes much deeper.
What does it fundamentally translate to?
It translates fundamentally to the systemic devaluation of human labor and goods. It is a structural mechanism designed to create artificial deficiency.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of that. How does an ancient civilization systematically devalue human labor without using the brute force of Al-Mikyal or the water monopolies of Thamud?
They utilize monopsony power and cartel collusion.
Monopsony power.
Yes. Think of weights and measures not as literal stones on a balance, but as the foundational standard of value in a society.
Right.
Tabkasu occurs when the elite class uses its massive, concentrated leverage to buy labor, raw materials, and goods from the working class for a fraction of their actual worth.
Because the elites control the trade routes and the capital, the worker has absolutely no alternative buyers.
Exactly. The elite dictate a suppressed price for labor and then turn around and sell their finished exported goods at massively inflated prices.
It is structural exploitation.
It is.
It's an entire economy engineered to act as a funnel, constantly siphoning wealth upward.
Yes. When a cartel controls the entire supply chain, the scale is already rigged long before the laborer ever shows up to work.
The workers' time, their sweat, their life energy is subjected to tabkasu. It is deliberately, systemically undervalued.
And the source material drives this home. It says,
Right.
You do not have the right to devalue the things of the people.
The elites are attempting to claim that the market naturally decided the labor is only worth pennies.
But Shuaib points out that the elites are the ones who rigged the market conditions to force that outcome.
Right.
And the text categorizes this quiet, orderly economic rigging with a very powerful word, Fasad.
Fasad. We usually hear that word translated as corruption or chaos on earth.
Yes.
The imagery that usually comes to mind is violent. We picture rioting in the streets, buildings burning, warlords slaughtering civilians, absolute anarchy.
But the linguistic brilliance of Parwez's analysis is showing how the text actually redefines Fasad.
How so?
In Madian, there was no physical rioting. There was no anarchy in the streets. The markets were highly regulated and orderly. Yet the text identifies their economic system as the ultimate form of Fasad.
An imbalanced economy, where wealth is aggressively hoarded at the top while the base is starved through tapkasu, is structural chaos.
Exactly.
The violence hasn't disappeared, it has merely changed forms.
Yes.
The violence is a family slowly starving over a decade because their wages are artificially suppressed.
Or the chronic stress, the generational degradation, and the destruction of human potential that poverty creates in a society, literally overflowing with wealth.
The absence of physical conflict does not mean a society is peaceful. It might just mean the working class is too exhausted and dominated to fight back.
And we really have to examine the tactics used to maintain that domination.
Yeah, how did the elites prevent honest competition?
Right. If someone heard Shuaib's message and wanted to start a fair, ethical business that actually paid workers their true value, how did the cartels stop them?
Parwez connects this to a concept from another part of the text, Surah Araf, which describes the elites of Madian sitting on the paths.
Sitting on the paths. In ancient terms, that instantly evokes the image of a highwayman.
A literal bandit with a sword hiding behind a rock, waiting to ambush a trade caravan and steal their gold.
But these elites were far too sophisticated for crude banditry. They acted as economic highwaymen.
They used their massive, consolidated wealth to blockade the metaphorical paths of commerce and fair trade.
Yes. If an honest businessman tried to enter the Madian market and actually play by a fair set of weights and measures, the cartels would instantly target him.
They would use predatory pricing.
Exactly. Selling their own goods at a massive loss, just long enough to bankrupt the honest competitor.
They would collude with material suppliers to ensure the ethical business couldn't even source raw goods.
They would freeze him out of the trade routes.
Yeah.
They systematically sat on the paths of commerce to ensure that anyone who refused to participate in their rigged system failed overnight.
It was a perfectly engineered quarantine against ethics.
That's a great way to put it.
And the parallels to modern corporate monopolies are just staggering.
Oh, they are everywhere.
When a massive global tech conglomerate sees a small, innovative startup gaining traction, they don't send hired goons to break the startup founder's kneecaps.
No, they employ modern tabkasu.
Yes, they use their infinite capital to buy up the startup supply chain.
Or they simply copy the startup's core product, integrate it into their own massive platform, and just give it away for free.
Until the startup bleeds out of cash and goes bankrupt.
And once the competition is dead, the monopoly raises prices again.
They sit on the digital paths.
It is the exact same architecture of suppression, just operating on servers instead of desert trade routes.
The elites of Madian were incredibly proud of this system. They believed they had constructed a perpetual motion machine of profit.
But Shuaib understands the fatal flaw in their design. A machine built purely on extraction eventually eats its own parts.
Yeah, when you rig the entire economy to hoard wealth at the top, you systematically hollow out the purchasing power and the stability of the foundation.
How does a society survive when it destroys the very people that keep it running?
So Shuaib isn't just an angry critic pointing out flaws. He presents a radical alternative economic theory to save them.
He introduces the concept of Baqiyatullah.
The literal translation of Baqiyatullah is that which Allah leaves with you, or the remainder from God.
Right. Shuaib stands in the center of their rigged markets and tells them that this Baqiyatullah is far better and more valuable for them than all of their hoarded capital.
Now, I try to put myself in the shoes of a Madian elite listening to this, and I feel immediate skepticism.
Naturally.
Whenever a religious figure tells a hyper-wealthy society that what God leaves you is better, it sounds like the ultimate pacifier.
It sounds like the ancient equivalent of promising someone a mansion in the afterlife, so they accept being poor and oppressed in this life.
Right. And if that's what Shuaib is saying, he's actually doing the elites a favor by keeping the underclass docile.
But that is a very common and very dangerous misinterpretation of the text.
How so?
Parwez attacks that reading aggressively, using the deep linguistic structure of the Arabic vocabulary. He proves that Shuaib is absolutely not offering a spiritual consolation prize for poverty.
He is delivering a lecture on tangible macroeconomic sustainability.
Yes.
How does the linguistics shift this from a spiritual promise to an economic theory?
Parwez contrasts two foundational concepts present in the linguistic roots, fauna and baketa.
Fauna and Baqiyat.
Right. Fauna refers to that which diminishes, fluctuates, decays, and ultimately perishes.
Okay.
Wealth generated through market rigging and tabkasu is inherently fauna. It is volatile.
Because it's not based on actual value.
Exactly. A cartel artificially inflates the price of goods, creating a massive bubble of paper wealth.
But because the underlying workers have no purchasing power, the bubble eventually bursts.
The wealth vanishes. It cannot endure because it is built on mathematical contradictions.
It's like getting a high score in a rigged video game.
Yeah.
It looks impressive on the spreadsheet, but it has no structural integrity in the real world.
Conversely, Baqiyat means that which endures, that which has permanence, stability, and lasting utility. So Parwez translates Baqiyatullah as the sustainable surplus.
The sustainable surplus. That sounds more like a term from a modern economic thesis than an ancient scripture.
Because it is an incredibly precise economic concept.
Wow.
Shuaib is arguing that a society's true strength, its ability to survive generation after generation, is not measured by the capital hoarded by its billionaires.
A civilization only survives based on the surplus it leaves behind?
Yes. The surplus it reinvests into the development, infrastructure, and betterment of humanity as a whole.
So if a modern corporation posts, that builds an enduring, stable society that can weather a crisis.
Exactly. Shuaib is trying to engineer a massive paradigm shift in how they define the very concept of value.
And this ties directly into another vital term the text uses, right? Rizqi Hasan.
Yes, Rizqi Hasan, which translates to good sustenance or beautiful provision.
Beautiful provision. The source material makes a razor-sharp distinction here between quantitative wealth and qualitative wealth.
It does.
Quantitative wealth is just the sheer accumulation of numbers.
Right, is the billionaire staring at a digital dashboard, watching his net worth tick up by another $10 million.
But that money isn't moving, it isn't building anything, it isn't curing any diseases or feeding any families.
It has zero qualitative impact on the human condition.
But Rizqi Hasan qualitative wealth actively adds beauty, dignity, and stability to the world.
It is wealth that serves humanity, rather than a system where humanity is enslaved to serve the generation of wealth.
Shuaib is essentially saying, I am not demanding that you become ascetic monks. I am not telling you to burn down your markets and live in caves. Commerce is necessary. But I am demanding that you practice an economics that generates Rizqi Hasan.
But the tragedy is that the elites simply laugh at him.
They are so deeply conditioned by their own greed that they literally cannot comprehend an economic model that isn't based on maximum ruthless extraction.
Parwez highlights a striking analogy to explain the psychological disconnect of these elites. He calls it the spare tire analogy.
The spare tire. I love this one.
It perfectly captures the profound hypocrisy of the ruling class.
Yeah.
Parwez notes that the elites of Madian, and honestly this applies perfectly to modern financial elites, they treat God, or universal ethical law, exactly like a spare tire on a long desert journey.
So you are driving a heavily armored luxury vehicle across the desert.
Right.
The road is incredibly smooth, the air conditioning is perfect, the music is loud.
And as long as the journey is comfortable, you do not give a single passing thought to the spare tire locked away in the dark trunk.
It is entirely irrelevant to your forward momentum.
They rely entirely on the four tires of their own economic engine. Their monopolies, their manipulated interest rates, their rigged weights and measures.
As long as the cartel is pulling in record profits, ethics are a nuisance.
The government regulators are told to step back.
The moral philosophers are mocked as naive.
They aggressively demand that the spare tire of ethics stay out of their business.
But then the vehicle hits a jagged rock.
Yes. The manipulated market finally crashes.
The exploited workers strike.
The supply chain fractures.
The economic engine implodes, and suddenly the tire violently bursts.
And that is the absolute only moment they remember the spare tire.
Wow.
When the vehicle of their exploitation breaks down, they suddenly invoke the name of God, or the necessity of ethics, or the vital importance of community solidarity.
They desperately want a quick ethical patch to fix their broken system.
It is the exact psychology behind every modern corporate bailout.
Privatize the gains, socialize the losses. During a boom, when banks are making billions off predatory, unethical loans, they scream about the free market and demand zero oversight.
But the second the bubble bursts and their institutions are facing bankruptcy, suddenly they run to the government.
Which represents the public treasury.
begging for trillions of dollars in bailouts.
Suddenly, they're talking about the greater good of the economy and how we all need to sacrifice together.
They want to use the public's ethics to patch the hole so they can get right back in the driver's seat of the exact same exploitative vehicle.
And Shuaib's radical, uncompromising message is that divine ethical law cannot be relegated to a spare tire.
No.
It cannot be an emergency patch you apply only when your corruption finally catches up to you.
Ethical law must be the engine driving the vehicle itself.
If the core engine of your society isn't built on Baqiyatullah, on sustainable justice and fair weights, you aren't just going to get a flat tire.
The physics of the system dictate that the entire vehicle is going to explode.
Which brings us to the terrifying conclusion of the Surah Hud narrative.
It really is terrifying.
Madian completely rejects Shu'aib's economic theory. They refuse to make ethics their engine.
They stubbornly stick to their rigged weights.
They mock Shu'aib's warnings, they threaten to exile him, and they double down on the systemic devaluation of Tabkasu.
Right.
So we have to ask, what actually happens when a civilization's foundational trust is entirely, irreversibly hollowed out?
Well, the narrative ends with a sudden, devastating event called the Siha.
The Siha.
The word translates literally to the shout or the blast.
Okay.
The text describes this blast overtaking Madian, leaving the elites prostrate and dead in their grand homes, wiping the civilization off the map as if they had never thrived there.
And for centuries, readers have interpreted the Siha as a literal, supernatural acoustic event.
Yeah, a magical sound wave that descends from the clouds and simply strikes the bad guys dead where they stand.
But Parwez frames the Siha through a completely different, deeply analytical lens.
He interprets the blast as a metaphor for social physics and catastrophic economic implosion.
Social physics. It is such a brilliant way to conceptualize human behavior.
It really is. It implies that there are immutable, unbreakable laws to how a society functions, just as strict as the laws of thermodynamics or gravity.
Right, if you hold a glass over a concrete floor and let go, it shatters. The universe doesn't negotiate with the glass.
Exactly. And similarly, if you systemically rig an economy for long enough, it collapses.
Because every single market on Earth, ancient or modern, operates on a shared, invisible currency.
Mutual trust.
Mutual trust.
The weights and measures are the physical representation of that trust.
Right.
A market only functions because the buyer and the seller fundamentally trust the baseline value of the exchange.
When an elite class spends generations engaging in Tabkasu, constantly devaluing labor, constantly inflating assets, constantly cheating the foundation, they destroy that mutual trust.
It is the physics of a bubble.
The elites keep pumping artificial air into the system, assuming the skin of the bubble can stretch infinitely.
But the skin cannot stretch infinitely. The Siha is the sudden, deafening, violent realization that the wealth they thought they had was an absolute illusion.
The moment the collective trust evaporates, the currency becomes instantly worthless.
The supply chains freeze in a matter of hours.
The economic implosion is so rapid, so violent, and so comprehensive that it hits the society with the destructive force of a physical blast wave.
And the text uses a chilling phrase to describe the aftermath of this blast.
Yeah.
It says, as if it had never thrived there.
As if it had never thrived there, it highlights the terrifying fragility of paper wealth.
Yes. When an economy built entirely on exploitation and artificial market inflation collapses, it doesn't slowly wind down over decades.
It happens overnight.
The cartel leaders, the industrialists, the billionaires of Madian are left utterly ruined inside their mansions.
The wealth they hoarded vanishes into thin air because it was never real to begin with.
It was entirely fauna. It had no Baqiyatullah to sustain it.
And we do not need to look at ancient history to understand the mechanics of the Siha.
No, we have witnessed these exact social physics assert themselves in our own recent lifetimes.
The 2008 global housing crisis is a perfect, terrifying modern parallel to the collapse of Madian.
It is a textbook example.
The architecture of that crisis was pure Tabkasu.
Yes.
You had a financial elite that systematically rigged the weights and measures of the global housing market.
They took highly toxic, incredibly risky subprime mortgages.
Loans deliberately pushed onto vulnerable people who could not afford them, which is a form of exploitation right out of the Madian playbook.
And they bundled these toxic assets together, and then they corrupted the rating agencies.
Right. The rating agencies, organizations like Moody's and Standard & Poor's, they were supposed to be the honest weights and measures of the modern market.
But they slapped premium AAA ratings on garbage assets.
They intentionally sold fauna as if it were Baqiyat.
They sold a mathematical illusion.
And for a few years, Everyone at the top was making billions. The modern Mahdian elites of Wall Street were popping champagne, earning record bonuses.
Bragging about their unprecedented mastery of the new economy.
And anyone who warned them that the system was mathematically unstable was dismissed as a naive alarmist who just didn't understand complex financial instruments.
The foundation was completely hollowed out by greed.
And then the Sayha arrived. The blast hit.
The collective, sudden realization rippled through the market that the assets holding up the entire global economy were entirely toxic.
The trust evaporated in an instant.
Giant, historic financial institutions that had survived world wars, massive firms like Lehman Brothers, simply vanished overnight.
Decades of institutional prestige wiped out in a weekend, as if they had never thrived there.
The trillions of dollars in paper wealth evaporated from the spreadsheets because it was never tethered to real value.
But the profound tragedy of the Sayha is that the blast radius isn't confined to the boardrooms.
No, it never is.
The elites rig the system, but when the implosion happens, the shockwave hits the most vulnerable people the hardest.
Entire working-class communities were left economically prostrate. Millions lost their homes, their life savings, their pensions, and their livelihoods.
The story of Mahdian ends in absolute ruin because it proves a terrifying, undeniable social theorem.
You cannot cheat the fundamental laws of economic justice indefinitely.
A powerful elite can manipulate the scales for a decade or a generation, maybe even two.
They can hide the violence in their spreadsheets and sit on the paths of commerce.
But eventually, the immutable physics of a hollowed-out society will assert themselves.
And the collapse will be absolute.
This has been a massive, intense journey through the ancient Surah Hud narrative.
It really has.
We started by examining a sarcastic, arrogant elite class who demanded that morality remain locked safely inside the mosque, completely severed from their bank accounts.
We dissected the quiet, systemic violence of Tabkasu, the deliberate devaluation of human labor, and the structural rigging of markets to siphon wealth upward.
We unpacked Shuaib's radical, deeply relevant alternative, the absolute necessity of Baqiyatullah, building a sustainable surplus that genuinely serves humanity, rather than treating divine ethics like an emergency spare tire.
And we observed the devastating social physics of the Sayah, the inevitable, catastrophic economic implosion that rips through a civilization when it systematically destroys its foundational trust.
It is a gritty, brilliant, and honestly unnerving critique of capitalism, market ethics, and the way we structure our world today.
But the most intimidating part of Parwez's analysis is that this is merely one stage of the civilizational rot detailed in the text.
Wow, really?
Yes. As we look ahead to the next phase of the source material, Ayat 96 to 109, we will be leaving the shattered, ruined markets of Madian behind and entering a completely different, even darker domain.
We've seen brute force with Ayat, we've seen resource enclosure with Thamud, we've seen social rot with Lut, and today we witness systemic economic rot with Madian. Where could the progression possibly go from here?
We are entering the domain of Pharaoh. Next time, we will witness what happens when all of these corrupted, exploitative systems merge and evolve into political rot. We will explore the chilling architecture of absolute tyranny and state-sponsored oppression.
The evolution from the market cartel to the absolute dictator,
Yes.
that is going to be a heavy, utterly essential continuation of this text. But before we wrap up today's analysis, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over the next time you scroll through the financial news, read about a massive corporate merger, or check the health of the stock market.
Right.
If the long-term survival of a civilization depends entirely on the integrity of its weights and measures, its baseline, uncompromising commitment to valuing human labor and maintaining mutual trust, take a long, hard look around at our modern global economy today. Look at the rise of the gig economy, where labor is perpetually devalued without benefits. Look at the staggering, unprecedented levels of wealth inequality. Look at the constant, exhausting cycle of market booms and catastrophic busts. Are our modern weights currently balanced? Or, if you listen very closely to the foundations of our system, are we already starting to hear the faint, distant rumble of our own seha?